Proper Pompey Podcast.
Supported by the Heritage Lottery Fund.
Hi, I'm Abby.
And I'm Joe.
And this is the Proper Pompey Podcast. Over the last few months, we've been investigating the Portsmouth accent and dialect, researching its history.
And looking at how the way we speak influences people's sense of identity. Today we interviewed Kev Smith, who was born and bred in Portsmouth and spent some years working in the dockyard. We asked him for his views on what makes the Pompey voice distinctive.
My name's Kev Smith and I'm a teacher at Hammond South Downs College, teaching media and film studies. I've always lived in Portsmouth. I was actually born on the border of Wimmering and Paulsgrove, and the words that stick in my mind really are, and my favourite words from the Portsmouth kind of dialect is Dinlow, of course, which is an absolute classic, which I think derives from kind of gypsy language. There's another one called, which I expect most people remember, is Squinny. I remember that from school. Everybody was called a Squinny for some reason or another. And there's a phrase that everybody uses in Portsmouth, especially from my childhood, which is putting "we" before every phrase almost that you ever say. "We, you were Dinlow, ain't ya?" A classic phrase from when I was a kid. Portsmouth is quite clearly an island race, possibly quite insular. People I think are very protective of the place, and it comes from having that island mentality. It's a bit of a siege mentality almost, and that could possibly be where a lot of the language comes from, almost to kind of repel borders. Anybody who's coming in from outside. Obviously, we've had some influx from London, etc. A lot of Cockney workers came down to the dockyard during the war years to work on the ships, etc. And I think a lot of that, we didn't particularly want them probably, but we had to have them. So, it's better than having people from Southampton coming in. I remember when I was in my youth and going on holidays abroad and meeting a lot of Londoners and Cockneys, they didn't have a clue what the word mush meant. But in recent years, I think they've kind of adopted the word. So we obviously adopted some of their language. They've obviously adopted some of ours, and I think one of the words that they now use a lot, if you watch TV programmes with Londoners and Cockneys in, they're all using the word. So it's just become kind of part of their language as well. To me, the Portsmouth dialect is an absolute amalgamation of the Hampshire accent, which has kind of got that Hampshire burr to it, and of course the influx of London accent, Cockney accent, estuary accent. So I think a few years ago we in Portsmouth were generally, especially sort of the war years and just after the war years, we had a real strong sort of Hampshire burr to it. Not as much as the bumpkins from up the road, because it's weird, they're only 20 miles away, but they have got the real Hampshire burr to their accent, a real kind of ooh-ah accent. I'm not being sort of derogatory about it, that's just the way they speak, probably because they're a bit closer to places like the New Forest, etc., whereas we're closer to London, so we naturally adopt that kind of more estuary accent. But it's definitely an amalgamation of the two. And the thing is, I think in Portsmouth we've changed our accent. We've definitely gone much more towards the estuary rather than the Hampshire burr. But it's still there. You can talk to people, especially older people in Portsmouth, and the Hampshire burr is still there. And I think it's fantastic that you've got your own kind of unique language. It's almost a shame that we've almost adopted this kind of universal estuary kind of accent, and we've lost that unique kind of Portsmouth twang that we used to have. It's still there in a lot of people. If you talk to people in Portsmouth, you can still hear it a lot, and I think that's great. And I think it's a bit of a shame that we're kind of losing our Portsmouth accent. It's almost kind of sort of derided now. If you hear somebody with that real right at the lights accent or roundabout accent, they almost get sort of have the mick taken out of them. It's a shame really, because it's our accent. That's where we came from. That was ours. It belonged to us, and we're kind of losing our grip on it really. I think we've come out of the Hampshire burr that we used to have, and that influence of estuary English has kind of overtaken us really in this town. I think it's overtaken a lot of the country, if you like. And I think it's that influence again of people coming down to work here. So our accent is not really as unique to us as it used to be, which is slightly unfortunate really, because it gives you an identity and it gives you a sense of place, and maybe we're losing a bit of that in Portsmouth. I spent quite a few years working in the dockyard, as many people in Portsmouth have, and they can testify to. It's a unique place. The dockyard, obviously there's only about 3 or 4 dockyards around the country, and it's definitely a unique place to work. It's got its own, it's almost like its own island within the Portsmouth island, if you like. So people kind of develop their own language, their own way of speaking, their own phrases, of course. One of the ones that I remember from the dockyard was Mater. Everybody was a Mater. Right, my Mater, how's it going, all right? And you can hear there already, there's kind of that Hampshire burr to it as well. And they had phrases like a dockyard oyster, for example, which I probably won't go into too much here, but you can imagine what that probably means. They used to wear things like Fionn coats, and they job and knocks, which means do your job and then leave. Double bubble for time and a half. There was all sorts of phrases. It was like a unique language. And of course, they always had the Portsmouth accent about right at the lights and here, mate, you going downtown tonight? Yeah, you going to eat? Yeah. It was a bit. Sorry, can we do it again?
Yeah, of course.
Sorry, let's do it again.
And it was always.
What did I say there, Dan?
You said, and it was always, where you going tonight? Downtown, round the roundabout, turn right at the lights, which is almost verging on a Southampton accent.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah, it had its own unique accent and a way of saying things and doing things, and one of the things I mainly remember is the way they would pronounce things like not right, or like they say, all right, my mater, where you going? Going out tonight? Yeah, go downtown, go round the roundabout, go right at the lights, and you're there, jobs are good. And, which most people say, well, what does that mean? What is that? They wouldn't get it. But of course, from that, you can probably detect there's a bit of that kind of Hampshire burr, almost like that Southampton kind of accent coming in. So that's obviously been passed down through the years in the dockyard, to different influxes of apprentices, etc. And you just adopt it. I remember my granddad had that kind of an accent. He worked in there for years and years, uncles, etc. Like everybody in Portsmouth, has got people they know that worked in there. And that gets passed down to the younger generations. Portsmouth dialect is so unique because we're an island. I think it basically comes down to that, maybe in the past, because you get that island mentality, you're not so conducive to people coming in, but you can't help by being influenced by different accents. Obviously, we've had lots of people coming from overseas because of the dockyard and it being a port. So we, more than anybody else probably in this country, have become a big kind of mishmash of different languages and different influences. You're bound to, because you're a seagoing port. And I think that makes Portsmouth absolutely unique in the country. I think globalisation could be possibly a threat to accents and dialects generally in the future, because the more you get involved in technology, everybody seems to adopt this kind of homogenous accent. There are some issues, I think, with too much American influence, actually, because even my children, they watch so much American stuff on TV, and some of the things that they say in their accent, they're talking in this kind of American twang, which I try to tell them about and stop them doing, But it's very, very difficult to do because it's just become this almost sort of flat language now, this kind of estuary language that everybody's adopting. And I just hope that in the future that doesn't influence us too much, because dialects are so crucial and important to a sense of place and identity in this country. We need to celebrate the Portsmouth dialect because we're unique. There's nobody else in the country or around the world that sounds like us, that's had so many influences as we have, and we're an island race and we should celebrate that. We come from an island, not many people in this country do, and you develop your own language, your own techniques, your own way of speaking, etc., your own sort of semantics, and it's fantastic and it should be celebrated. We are unique.
Join us next week where we talk to Professor James Burridge about where and how dialects occur.
Proper Pompey Podcast.
Supported by the Heritage Lottery Fund.